Yes, we can see your screen clear and we can hear you loud and clear as well. So without further ado, over to you, Richard.
Great, thanks very much, Noreen. Yeah, first of all, just thank you for allowing me to present today. Been quite excited about it. This is my first presentation within the Dynamics community. I've been getting a little bit more involved with it over the last couple of months. I feel like I've received so much from the community. It's a pleasure to be able to offer something back. So yeah, I wanted to do the presentation today on case management within Dynamics 365. It was a project that we worked on extensively to kickstart a. It was for a large public sector organisation, and of course, out the box, case management I feel just works so well within Dynamics, and it's built on so many great foundational concepts. But it's one thing knowing how the software works. It's something completely different knowing how to implement it. Where do you start? How do you set up the right structures in the beginning in order for it to then go forward and have success? So I wanted to do this less today around a technical presentation and more based around a project approach. So if anyone does want to go into any details of the technical details, please feel free to either ask questions or on at the end, or to connect with me, and I'm more than happy to talk and share experiences around that. So just a little bit about me. I'm a lead Dynamics 365 consultant, and I've been working with Dynamics specifically for over 5 years. For the previous years before that, I had my own software company servicing scientific research institutions, database systems to them, and that company I closed down in 2015, very sadly, actually. It was for various reasons. I could probably do a whole presentation on that, actually. But it was one around commercial viability. But in a way, the silver lining was finding Dynamics. I always used to say when I owned that business that, one day we're going to get to a point where you have a handful of companies that service everything on the internet, and you can build things very quickly, very easily. And of course, Dynamics is one of those. And I absolutely love Dynamics and what you can do with it and how it can transform businesses. So I mainly work on the functional consultant, although I'm quite a hybrid consultant. I've done development in the past, and BA, functional work, solution architect work. And I work alongside partners and end clients as well. So to talk a little bit then about today, so I'll go into the background of the project just to set the scene. We'll talk about the challenges that were faced right from the beginning, and then we'll start to look at how did we then approach that, both in terms of Agile, and for those that don't know, I'll go into a little bit more about Agile, how we structured the team, and more importantly, how did we then structure how we did the analysis, the design, and the review in order to be able to ensure that it was understood by all parts of the business. We then look at the roadmap going forward. So, because I think there's two distinct parts to this. There's the first part, which is, especially in an agile approach, getting it to the point of a minimum viable solution. And then it's how do you then take it forward from there? And I think there's two very different approaches, actually. So I'll cover both of those approaches. We'll look at some design considerations in terms of the solution design, and I'll also share some additional lessons that I learned along the way. So in terms of the background, as I mentioned, it was a large public sector organization, and as with most organizations, they work very much off of spreadsheets. At the point, obviously, before we come into Dynamics 365, it's very email based, it's very spreadsheet based. And what I found with organizations like that, it's we have to make sure that we take the users along with the journey, because it can be quite daunting from going from one spreadsheet email based system into a fully fledged, beautiful Dynamics 365 implementation. And any kind of change is quite daunting. So it's taken them along that process, and you'll see as part of the approach, we very much incorporated that into the approach. We started off with a few processes. So just to take a step back a little bit, just to cover off, so case management in Dynamics, for those, just as a very simple example, a case could come in which is like an inquiry from a client, and it could just be a simple matter of we answer the inquiry and we close it down. But also it can go to very complex type cases, which requires multiple different department involvement. It could involve multiple different stages, handoffs, requesting information, cycles around various different processes, so they can get extremely complicated. And if you think of it in terms of an entire organization that wants to implement Dynamics and all the cases that they have into Dynamics in this one common case management system, we need to be able to start somewhere. But of course, how do you then start off to make sure that you incorporate the complexities going forward? So, and I think it was set up really well in terms of the processes that we started on. We started on what could be seen as relatively simple in terms of complaints, inquiries, information disclosure requests. And then we had a relatively complex one, which is a risk assessment team that provided support to various departments in regard to various processes. And it got a little bit complicated, that one. So it was good that we involved that right at the start to help us think about some of those more complexities as we go throughout the organization. So the future was always that we would roll it out throughout the organization. So we had to have a mind on that right from the start as to how we build the cases, so that we wouldn't build it in a certain way and then later on down the line realize, oh, we've got this completely wrong. Because of course that's the fear here, isn't it? So the challenge, as I mentioned, so where do we actually start? How do we create a common framework? And it's not just a framework of how we build the software, but how do we create a framework that's going to allow us to analyze all the different processes in a very set, specific way. So we know what we're doing, the client knows what to expect and how we're going to work with them. And we can measure that. So where are we along that analysis process? But then moving into more the design, how do we design in a specific way? Again, so that this is mainly to do with a set way of doing it, but also make sure everyone's on the same page with it. How do we develop? And then how do we review? So what's the framework for all of that? And that's really about getting us to that minimum viable product. I'll come on to that again in a moment. But then again, how do we then move beyond that minimum viable product into, okay, so it's working for that business, for that department. It may not be working in the most efficient and effective way, but then how do we move that forward so we have a roadmap to continually evolve it for that department, but also incorporate other departments and start to roll it out throughout the organization in a succinct way. So in terms of where we started, we had a 1 month discovery period to go and look at those processes and to gather the information in order enough to get us started. But we also had to set up these foundations within that time, because if we start developing too soon, then some of the structures that we're setting up may need to be refactored. So that first month is such a crucial period. And what I'm going to show you, the approach that we started to design, really helped in so many different ways. So what I'm hoping is that other consultants, other organizations can use these as templates to help with that first kickoff month, which is so crucial. The approach. So just to give a little bit of a bit more for those that don't know on Agile. Of course, Agile is very, we're either Agile or we're waterfall, you hear. And I've worked in both environments. Waterfall is kind of where you do all of the requirements up front first. You then do all of the design of the solution. You then get it developed. You then get it tested, and then you get it delivered. Which I've had many different experiences when I've been burned from that for multiple different reasons. And Agile kinds of comes in here and says, well, let's start off and assume that we're just going to get the bare basics to get it set up. We'll deliver something, see if the client is what the client wants. That buys us time to look at more analysis, get more development done, and we can start off with something just quite rudimentary, and then over time we build it up to this amazing, incredible system, and the customer is with us on that in the entirety of that journey, feeding back and making sure that it's going in the direction that they want it to go in. So I personally am a huge advocate of Agile. I absolutely love it. It took me a little bit of a time to transition my mind into working differently to waterfall, but once I did, the benefits of it are just brilliant. You do have, and I know of other projects that have a mixture of both. So they do a bit of Agile and a bit of waterfall, and it's a lot of the time I see that it's down to the organizations themselves aren't truly ready and prepared for an Agile way of working. But it's fine. I mean, either way, we can get it to work. But personally, I love the Agile. So we started off with a very small team, and it was on the basis of, over time we would scale up, but certainly we would get the ball rolling. We would get the fundamentals of the foundations of the process set up. So we had a product owner, we had process owners. Process owners are really the people that, like, for example, the managers maybe of the complaints team, of the information request team, of the risk assessment team. We had one functional consultant, which was myself. We had a business analyst, a solution architect, and one developer. And we had 2-week sprints. So in terms of the approach, again, we've said, so there's 3 different parts of how we're going to set this framework up. The first is the analysis. That's working with the business. It's working with the BAs to make sure that we extract the information in a specific way that's useful within Dynamics. And I'll go into that in a little bit more in a moment. The development, which is much more working with the other development team, with the solution architect, with the developers, and making sure that we develop in a certain way that makes sense to us, but also we can communicate with the business so they see exactly what's happening and where we are within that process, and where it falls in, where that development falls in, into the life cycle of that development, so everyone knows exactly where they are. And then the review. So how do we create a structure so the business knows at what points we're going to feed back to them? What do they expect? What can they expect? And at what point we're going to get to that minimum viable product, and how we're going to go beyond that. So it's quite a bit of information here. Let me just take it back though and just go through one step at a time. So this is the analysis phase, and it's the process that we developed that would help us understand what order we would do things in terms of when we first start interacting with the business, and how do we gather the information, what are the different workshops that we're going to run, what are going to be outputs, what are going to be the responsibilities of the people involved within the project. So the very first one is the process mapping and user stories. So that's where we go in, it's led by the business analyst, and we work out what the as-is process is. We work with the process owners. And we also list out any user-written stories. Now, I said I would come back to this because Dynamics 365 case management works in a very specific way. So usual and traditional business analyst techniques don't necessarily work so well. I'm not going to go as far as to discount them because I think they do play a huge role. But let's say traditionally, if you're building a bespoke software application, you would sit down, you'd work out what all the requirements were, you would turn them into user stories. And for those that don't know, a user story is essentially just, it's a requirement. So as a user, I want to be able to create a new case so that, I mean, I'm hugely simplifying it there, so that, and then it's got some benefits so that you can process inquiries, for example. So it's a requirement that's then used to develop down from there. So in traditional bespoke software development, you would get those list of user stories, hand them off to the functional consultant who would design them up. The developers would develop and then give something back. But with Dynamics, it works in a very specific way. So whilst it is good that you gather the user requirements in that way, it's not necessarily those user stories that then need to be developed, because they have to be in a very consistent and structured way that works well with Dynamics. So we still gather those list of user requirements because it still helps us to understand what it is that the user is going to expect out of the system. I mean, the other part here is that because we're working with an organization that are used to working with spreadsheets, they often don't know what's possible. So it's very much got to be developed in tandem with the functional consultant to start showing what the possibilities are, if it's appropriate. If not, to actually take them along slowly on that journey. Because it's not like we can actually go and say, look, here's what you're going to get, here's the possibilities. Because actually sometimes that needs to happen in stages. So as an example to that, when we come out of this first as-is process and user story session, we develop, and the functional consultant developed a D365 ready to-be process map. So knowing how Dynamics 365 case management works, we take their process and we put it into a to-be, which we then go and run past them. And most of the time, that hugely elevates. Just putting it into Dynamics hugely elevates the process and cuts out a lot of the waste. So we then go into the process and story analysis, where the BA takes all of the stories written by the users about what they want, starts to combine them, and starts to fill in any blanks in that process, so items stories they may have missed. We then go through story prioritization with the process owners to identify, out of all of those stories, what do they feel is most important to them, because that helps us get to the stage of a minimum viable product. So of course, a minimum viable product is everything that you need in a process in order for it to function at its minimum. It could, for example, things that we could leave out is report writing or requests for information from other departments. We could say, look, in the meantime, just still consistently send emails, and later on we'll put in additional functionality to automate that and make it much more seamless. We put story points so we get to understand how much work it's going to take. And then we go into case management mapping, which is very much led by the functional consultant, and who demonstrates Dynamics 365 case management out of the box, and then looks to gather the information needed in order to create the process. Because up until now, we only have the user stories about what the users want. So, for example, some of the things that we mainly need to develop a minimum viable product case management system are stages and statuses. So let me just come to this following slide a moment. For those that haven't seen the case management or just a recap, so we've got up here, don't know if you can see my cursor, but we've got up here the business process flow, which is the flow of the different stages through the case, with whatever different type of case it is. Out the box, we just have a very rudimentary one, which is that you identify the case. So, you know, who the customer is. We then research around, you know, if it's an inquiry, and we resolve the case. So if we was to send back the information. So what's most important when we're working with any new department is, what are your stages? What are the stages that you go through in your process? And then what are the different statuses? So we see up the top right, we have just in progress. But for whilst you're in any stage, you could have various different statuses. So for example, when we're in the research stage, it could be that we're gathering information. That could be the status. It could be that we've requested information from another department. It could be that we're writing a certain report, or we're waiting for a certain report to come back to us. So it allows anyone who's going into the cases to be able to see not only what stage they're in, but what status they're in as well. So we need those to start off any process. We also need, what are the fields and the rules in each of those stages? So what data do we want to be able to collect, and what are the rules around them? So for example, if it's if it's a certain type of case, it may be high profile, in which case it may need us to, if it's a high profile case, send it off to director for signing off before we proceed with it. So we need to understand what rules there are around that data as well. We need to understand what they want to see on the form, not just in the business process flow at the top here, but what do they want to see in their form? What are any SLA, service level agreements, that they have around that specific case, whether it's an internal SLA or whether it's a legislation SLA. And the last one, what views, charts and dashboards do they need, both the team, do the management need, in order to, because of course, one thing getting data into the system and processing it, but the core, as we've seen, you know, from some great presentations today, it's the data that we have that gives us so many possibilities and what we can do with that. So what views, charts, dashboards, reporting do they want to be able to attain from that information? So after we've done the case management mapping, we then inject all of those, the information that we've received, into the stories that we've created above. And actually, I'll go through this story development in a moment, because there's another structure that we put forward for managing those stories. And after that, we can get the stories signed off by the process owner and the product owner. we then put them into development, and after that is where we go into continuous improvement analysis, and that's where I'll come into later on in terms of the road mapping. So that's the analysis process that we went through in order to get the information that we need to get them to an MVP status, because at this point we'd have all of that information that we need. So the next part is a development. So again, bit of information here, but I'll break it down. In terms of, so you'll see here CCMF here at the top left, which refers to a common case management framework. This was something that we designed around. Every case is going to have this kind of a process. So every case is going to have a lodge request and create case. It's always going to have an initial starting point. It's always going to have stages and statuses that it goes through. We're always going to, well, likely we're going to have case assignment or escalations, close, reopen cases. So what these are story skeletons, which allow us to take the information that we've received in the last analysis session, inject them into these stories, and then be able to put them into development. Because this is a great structure for, one, communicating to the business where we're at with each of these stories, what each one is for, and likewise with the developers. And in the early days of the project, people were, it took a little bit of time, but the moment that people got used to this, it went like clockwork, both in terms of the business understanding, but also the developers and knowing what is expected of them when each of these stories come through. And each of these stories mean something. So for example, the lodge request and create case, it enables the case creation and includes all the basic views, queues, and security roles. So when we put that story in, we know to include every part of how the case can be created and all the structures to start setting up that new process, like the views, queues, security roles. The stages and statuses actually build out the process. And where we start bringing the case assignment and escalation, that's where it all starts to come to life. That's where we can then even start to test, you know, if this data equals this, does it go to that person? And all of those escalation processes. And that starts to build on the security role, because then we're incorporating different people, different teams into the process. We then go into close and reopen the case, which is where we add the criteria to resolve the case and anything we need to do to reopen the case. And then we go into adding in all the fields, rules and permissions that we spoke about, which we collected earlier. Again, further builds out the security roles, because we may need to be putting in field security profiles who can see which data in that process. And then form requirements, anything that is specific to those teams. Now, activities, this is where, of course, you have out the box activities, but there may be specific type activities such as request for information, referrals, business tasking. We then have a story around SLAs, further stories about views, charts, reports and dashboards, which occasionally we may have even put into lodge request and create case, or even field rules and permissions. It just depended what made more sense to inject them in. And then we've got the agile continuous improvement stories, which is a different matter, and again, I'll cover in the roadmap. So that was the structure of stories that went into development that everybody understood. But off the back of that process, we could then communicate to the business at what point we was going to show them a review, because there's no point doing just the, you know, usually agile works that after every sprint, you show the business what development work you've done. But let's just say we did just stories 1 and 2, lodge request, create case and stages and statuses. That's not really going to be useful for them. So what we did is we said, okay, let's instead communicate that we're going to give you a process demonstration after story 4 is complete, because that at that point the whole process is built out and we can show all the escalations, closing, opening. We then give a data demonstration after that, after story 6. So that's where we put in all the fields, rules, permissions, and form, so that the form has all been built out. So all the data fields have been put in. And at the end of story 9 is where we have the usable product demonstration, or the MVP. So that's the point we can say, okay, after this third demonstration, this is when we can deliver it to you to actually be usable in its very basic sense as a minimum viable product. And after that, we'll then start to build the process out, see how you're using it, and continually improve it going forward. So that structure worked really well to communicate to people as to what to expect when they would see reviews. So the analysis, because we come out with this structure, it enabled us to be able to communicate to the business how much progress we was making in each of the different stages, not just in the development, but in the analysis work itself. And I'm a big one on communication. Just to tell you a little bit of a personal story, I had a contract a number of years ago, and we were working so hard and we was doing so much work, and one of our clients came up and started having a right go at me because some of their work, she was saying some of the work hadn't been done, and I was getting this from across the business, like, why aren't you doing this, why aren't you doing that? But what I realized, it wasn't that we wasn't doing it and that we wasn't working hard. It was because our channels of communication weren't there. So I worked really hard trying to put structures into place to make sure that we could always communicate what we was doing and when we were doing it, so that everybody felt comfortable. Because it can have a real detrimental effect if someone starts to feel negative about the project. It can be like a wildfire, and that's certainly something we want to do everything we can to prevent. So as we can see here, and this was just something I would update every week or two, just to show where we were, how much of a percentage we had done in each one of those analysis stages for each of the different processes. So that worked really well. We could also use that common case management framework to attach story numbers to each of those stories and then show the progress around those. So we couldn't just show where we were with the analysis. We could also show just graphically, as we had our meetings with the process owners and the product owners, where we were within that development cycle and how close we were coming to the reviews. So we've talked a lot, really. That gets us to the MVP stage. Oh, sorry guys, there's someone unmuted. So if everyone can just be conscious of just muting, please. Thank you. Okay, so agile roadmap. So this is where we're now at an MVP stage and we want to take it forward. So we've got that minimum viable product and we want to take it forward from there. So one of the things that we realized was that in order to go forward, and there's always the temptation when doing continuous improvement work, that you gather requirements about, from users, say, look, I'm really not happy with this, I'm really not happy with that. And you have various, especially when you're working on different processes, you have lots of people saying lots of different things about what they would like to have improved. And there's a definite tendency to want to go and help people and just say, okay, I'll fix that for you. Okay, I'll fix this, I'll fix that. but it can become very unwielding, and it could also mean that if we fix something in one area and then someone else has a conflicting issue, we can find ourselves just bouncing backwards and forwards, not really getting anywhere. The solutions themselves start to get quite messy, and especially when we want to spread throughout an entire organization, we really need to keep a track of what we're doing, how we're doing, and doing it in a very methodical way throughout the organization. So we came up with a roadmap template, which is just something as simple as a requirements document. But we also started to look at how do we then bundle those requirements to make sure that when we're doing updates, we're focusing on very specific areas, but not just for us to know where we are, it's for the business, because ultimately the business needs to be able to decide for themselves what order they're going to do things, but also to make decisions not just about the order, but the resource that they can put into it, both in terms of manpower, the finances that they can put towards it. It's they need to have the right information in order to be able to make those decisions. So story bundles and that template, as I'll show you in a moment, really help towards that. Because ultimately, out of those first two parts, we want to be able to understand what the release plan is and what are the various different scenarios that the business could go down, so they could make an informed decision as to how the development will proceed. So again, not to scare you with a big table, apologies. So just to go through this in some sort of order. So the sources, this is essentially our requirements template. So the sources are the initial stories that we collected from the users as to how they wanted the system to be able to work, how they envisaged it working. Anything that we've collected during the reviews and implementing the MVP. And then also we went through a process of process visioning with them. So each, because if you remember back in when we collected the case management mapping, we purely just collected it around how they saw it right now. So now we want to start to move them into blue sky thinking. Like, if you could have the most amazing system that you could ever have, what would it look like? And this was a joint effort between the change management team, the BAs, and the functional consultant, because to have various different points of view, but also, to help them maybe see in certain parts of the process, they may not see that it's, that it's a little bit convoluted. So to have lots of different eyes on it and talking through some of those pain points, but also the functional consultant there to kind of show, here's some of the amazing functionality that you could start to incorporate. And it's always a little bit, in a way, it's a little bit, we need to manage expectations as well, which is why change management is so crucial at this stage, because you get everyone thinking blue sky thinking, but then they really get attached to that. And then you've got to come back down and kind of say, okay, but let's look at now doing this in stages, and to kind of reset expectations and how much time and resources available as to how far we go with that project. So we see here, we just list our features down the left-hand side. The process here, again, whether it's common case management framework. So if it affects more than one department, then we need to make sure that everyone that's going to impact is involved in the analysis of it and to the review, and make sure that it works for everyone. We then start to, as a functional consultant BA, we start to look at how do we put those into bundles. So it makes sense that so we have a collection of stories, very similar stories. So we're not doing what I mentioned before, going off doing one thing, then doing a conflicting thing 3 weeks later. We want to try and bring all this together in one place, and then bundle them from there so we understand it properly. And some of these other columns are actually really good for helping the business in terms of if we was to do pivots, we can provide pivot tables around these. So we have the type, whether it's a tidy up, whether it's an innovation improvement, whether it's automation. So that if we was to start to analyze, a whole bunch of requirements, how much of that is just tidy ups? How much of it is innovation? Because it's a useful piece of information for them to start to understand. We don't want to just keep on working on tidy ups. We've got to move towards innovation so that we can show that we're spending our money wisely. Moscow, which of course really helps, must have, should have, could have, would have. That really helps with the pivots and understanding what we can do and in what time. The ranking is where we went through with each of the different process owners individually and then collectively. So individually, we said, how would you rank the ones that affect you? And then collectively, we kind of put them all in a room and had some interesting discussions around how they felt that ranked. And actually, a lot of the time, they would challenge each other and then come to a general consensus, which was great. The status of where all of those stories are. Any stories in our DevOps or whatever system we use for recording the stories. Story points at this stage are purely just a functional consultant's view as to how long it may take, because it just really helps with understanding what can we do in what time if we have a general sense of what it is, of how long something's going to take to develop. Releases. Again, actually, that comes into a bit more. You'll see it in a couple of slides. But also this last part, out of the box, I found this to be quite useful. And as the last presentation was focused a lot around the no-code, low-code solution, I'd certainly advocate as well any clients to have a no-code rule, which doesn't actually mean no code whatsoever, but it's just, can we really do this without using code? I had a client a couple of years back that went from 2011 to 2000 and sorry, it was CRM4 to 2011, and the amount of code, the amount of money they had to spend on updating the code was just incredible. So since then, I've always kind of had that rule of let's do as little code as possible, because it's so much easier to upgrade, and of course it's maintainable, much easier, and it's much easier now with the Power Platform and the advances that have been made in Dynamics 365. But it's not to say there's no code, but it's just, of course, only if we need it. And the business found it really useful to understand just how much of a percentage of that feature was going to be code versus how much of it would be out of the box functionality. So again, all this information just provides data in order for the business to be able to make decisions. So we see here, here's where we start to look at story bundles. So we've pivoted the data based on those story bundles. We can start to see the extent of the work for each of those. So we can see there, just in where's an example, request for further information. That's where we may go out to external stakeholders or different areas within the same business. Requesting information from them is something that could be set up as an activity, and all the work contained around that, we estimated at roughly about 32 story points. But on the left here, sorry, that's this one down here. But as we see, this on the left includes all the must-have, should-have, and could-haves. So the total comes to 300 story points. So we could say to the business straight off, do you want to spend 300 story points and include everything? Usual answer is, well, no. Okay, so let's go to must-haves only. So out of all of those features, we've estimated request for information goes down to 27. But you can see others have been eliminated altogether. So out of all of those, it would be 155 story points. And then they can start to look at and talk about those different story bundles, like what means most to them. So they can start to envisage how they would want to plan going forward. But one other crucial aspect of this is not just prioritizing, but it's also looking at the resource, the release plan. So how many developers do we have? How many sprints? How often are the sprints? But also, what is the allocation of story points within those sprints? So it could be that if we only have one developer and we're going to go live with an MVP, it's likely that they're going to be needing to support that go live. So the amount of days or efforts that they have to work on new development work goes down quite significantly. So if we could map this release plan as to how much time they have available, of course, it helps us to understand when we look back at then the story points for each of the bundles, various different scenarios that we can give to the business. So this is where we then sit down with the business, taking all of that information that we've just looked at, and we've said, okay, so you've got 3 different scenarios. You could have all the full bundle implementation with all the must-have, should-have, could-have, would-haves. We could look to just implement one process out of all of those different ones we was working on, inquiries, complaints, and the risk assessments. Or we could have a split focus, and then everyone sit in a room to work out what order they would want them to go in, and then look at the release plan to say how many points that we've got. And this was a really interesting point to be, because when we had all this information and we delivered it to the client in a meeting structure, and we said, okay, so all the process owners, the product owners are in the room, how would you like to proceed? And of course, it's a really interesting meeting to be a part of, because of course people see what they want for themselves, but they also start to see how the progression of the entire project is going to go forward. So at what point they could start to receive the functionality, and out of that, I then started to find that whereas people thought other certain parts that they were saying are totally must-haves, when they looked at it in this way as to here is the plan and here's when likely things would be released, it started to show just where priorities were, and eventually everyone landed on a very very collaborative release plan, and of course everyone was happy and knew what was going to happen and when it was going to happen. And of course this needs to then be reviewed very often, just to make sure priorities are the same. We can continue to give feedback along the way, so everyone knew where they was at. So we talked so far just mainly about the project approach. So I just want to highlight some of the design considerations in terms of the functionality. So we've got the common case stories, and this is just something, it's just to highlight that it's something we need to involve all of those teams in to make sure that everyone has an input in stories that are going to affect them. We did have a couple of occasions where we didn't do that, and it never goes right, because if someone isn't in the room and it affects them, they're going to have some form of issue against it. So there needs to be the right people in the room. An initiation stage. So if, for example, we're looking at 20, 30, 40, 50 cases, even hundreds of cases, different types of processes, there has to be an initiation stage or initiation, first stage, where the case is lodged. we then select the type of case, which could be auto-selected depending on where it's coming from and perhaps web forms that are being filled in. And then certain fields are made available to gather other information, and then it goes off down that specific route. So there has to be that starting point, and that should really be thought about from the start and put in there, because of course, if we're creating 5 or 10 different processes and then come back to that, it's not easy to add it in at that stage. Stage reuse. So for example, there's, this is one of the common design considerations, both in terms of the stages and the fields, because if we've created a stage and it's very similar across the business, so for example, management checks, or it could be certain reviews, or even the case closure, when there's a common stage that happens from various different processes, it's good to design that for reuse. Similarly with the fields, we're not going to want to put in all new fields for all new processes. But what is important, I found, is understanding, communicating the responsibility of that. Is it the functional consultant's responsibility to make sure there's no field reuse, or is it the developers? And what I found with that, it is really a joint effort. Both have eyes on it, because you really don't want to be creating 2 different fields which are collecting the same data across 2 different processes, because then when we want to report on it, it's not ideal. Form reuse, I'm an advocate not of creating a generic form for everyone to use, because it's got to feel like it's personalized to that team. I think, user adoption is really based on feeling like they're a part of it and feeling like they have some kind of ownership, and just having their own very specific form. Or now we could do apps. It's I think that's really important. SLAs. So one word on that, especially with case management, they can be quite complicated. So it requires a certain strategy with it. Because of course you may have an internal SLA which is 30 days, but you could have a legislation that says 1 calendar month. So actually working out those right up front and the strategy that we're going to apply so that we can communicate with the business is crucial. But also one thing to be mindful about is reporting fields, because let's say if we want to reopen a case, because it needs a review, and many cases do go through that process. When we reopen the case, the date that it was closed isn't easy to get to in terms of the reporting purposes. So it's good to set up reporting fields to collect information about the case that's going to be used in reports. There are ways, it just gets a little bit complicated, so I much prefer to go with some specific reporting fields. And then case closure, just to think about, a generic way of how cases are going to be closed. Because, for example, adding in knowledge-based fields, like how can we learn? How can the business learn from those? What can they take from the cases, and who's going to be responsible? So giving some thought as to what can go into that case closure was useful. So I'm conscious I'm almost out of time. And so along this way, I've talked about really what I've learned along the way, but I thought just a few additional things to add would be just the importance of having weekly or bi-weekly common case meetings with the full sprint team, the full process owners, product owners, to make sure that and that they know the importance of coming to that, because of course, if we start developing something that, as I said, does have an impact on them, and they're not involved, it can cause huge problems down the line. So what we did, we set up weekly common case meetings and an individual weekly meeting with each process owner. So for those stories that we're working on specifically just for them. As I mentioned before, the Dynamics 365 case management does work in a very specific very good way, in my opinion. And it only serves to help upskilling those BAs as soon as possible to make sure that they understand how the system works, and so that they can get on board and be developing it in the same way as well. And finally, efficient change management structures. None of it would have been possible without a brilliant change management team, which we had helping to support and making sure that the users, the business owners, the managers, the directors, that everybody understands what's going on, and they're being handheld through that entire process. So they really feel like a part of it, and they get excited about the product, because this is the thing, isn't it? It's helping people feel excited about the change that's happening, because it does do wonderful things to businesses. Dynamics 365, and that's all I got. So I want to say thank you very much for listening. Thank you for letting me share. I hope someone managed to get something from that, but if not, I've enjoyed myself anyway, so thank you, and I'll open the floor to any questions.
Thank you, Richard, and that was really informative session as well. I was kind of glued to it, and particularly the roadmap template you shared, which is kind of really helpful to me as well. Just looking at chat, we haven't got any questions. So if anyone has a question, please feel free to post it in chat or to ask Richard now. We have 3 minutes to go. Actually, Richard, I have a question.
Okay.
Have you, what's your view on your step methodology, which is pretty much, I believe it's a combination or hybrid methodology of Agile and Waterfall, specifically developed for Dynamics project. What do you think? Is it kind of really helpful to organizations, or?
Yeah, it's a good question. I've never actually worked with SureStep. However, in doing the Agile courses and speaking with various people, Agile came as a result of quite a few failures using SureStep, and I can't comment whether that's true or not, because I never used it personally, and I think it's very much an individual-based consultant approach, but also what's right for the business. So yeah, because I've never used it, I'm not too sure I can comment, but that's my experience with that.
Okay. Before I ask next question, so we have a question from Dave. Difference between BA and functional consultant and solution architect roles?
It's a great question, because that's something that we really had to nail down. And a business analyst, it is a fairly floating role, and you can find that the BA and the functional consultant, especially in the early days, can kind of butt heads a little bit trying to find their roles. But what we found was the difference was that a BA is essentially someone that does work really with the business to understand and is an advocate of the business and making sure that all of their requirements are being captured. The functional consultant, even though we work closely with the business, we kind of leave that to the BA, but at the same time, we're then responsible for making sure those requirements are being designed in the right way. And then the solution architect is the person that looks at, because we're talking here about one work stream, case management, but there could be multiple work streams. So to make sure that what we're developing is also in line with other parts of different work streams, that's what then the solution architect is responsible for, and understanding the various different technologies that we have available to us as we're building.
Absolutely, that's clear differentiation as well. And I work as an enterprise and solution architect in wear the different hats, and I always get asked this question as well. So not to be confused with application architect, data architect, infrastructure architect, security architect, or business architect. Solution architect has an overall role to look after pretty much every corners and area. So it's a very interesting position, actually. And I personally quite enjoy, but it actually thinks out of the box and looks at multiple solutions, where the enterprise architect looks at, like, overall enterprise level, how all the solutions gets fit within organization. So yeah, that's clear differentiation.
Absolutely, yeah.
How do you, so there is a question from Gulshan. How do you deal with any advice sought regarding license management?
Well, I guess it depends what kind of organization we're working with. If it's an enterprise one, I'd refer them to the project management. Of course, if you're in Scrum, it may not be project management, but it all depends on who's responsible for that. Of course, if we're dealing with smaller clients and we're working with them directly, then we'll just have those conversations about what's available, what they've purchased, and then what they need going forward and what their resources are.